Just want to spend a few minutes talking about reasoning and persuasion. Most of this comes pretty directly from chapter 17. In chapter 17, which is methods of persuasion, your textbook talks about building credibility to persuade. Extremely effective. We have to feel like you're a believable person to be persuaded by you. Of course, that's ethos. Your textbook also talks about using emotional appeals to persuade. And it's a little dangerous, emotional appeals to persuade. But emotions can be extremely strong, but they can backfire too. Of course, emotions are pathos. But what I want to talk with you about, and you have an exercise about, is logos, using reasoning to persuade, and organization, and logic in general. We're going to particularly talk about reasoning. Your textbook talks about 4 general categories of reasoning. And they're useful. I've added some other names here to them also, though. Some other words you might find more, you may have heard of before. For instance, your textbook calls something called specific instance, reasoning from specific instance. And you may have heard that called inductive reasoning. That's the same thing. The example in your textbook, my phys ed course last term was easy. My roommate's phys ed course was easy. My brother's phys ed course was easy. These are all specific instances, specific small examples. Therefore, the conclusion is my physical edu courses in general are easy. So we make a generalization from specific instances. We reason from specific things. That's great if those things all really do add up to that. That's the problem, right? Deductive reasoning is what is in your textbook is called reasoning from principle. And the classic example that's used over and over again is all people are mortal. Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. So in this case, we take some big examples, right? And we generalize from them to a statement about a specific thing. So that's deductive reasoning, reasoning from big principles, general principles, to a specific principle. Well, that's fine if your general principles are not false. All right, so that'd be one problem. What if there's a problem with one of your general principles? Causal reasoning. The idea is one thing causes another. The example given in your textbook is there's ice on the sidewalk, you slip and fall, you break your arm. Therefore, because of the ice on the sidewalk, I fell and broke my arm. The problem becomes sometimes things that come before something, sometimes things that appear linked to something by a cause are not at all. Maybe it's just a coincidence, right? And then analogic reasoning, or reasoning by analogy, which I didn't write down here, but that's probably a better way to say it. Reasoning by analogy is because one thing is true, therefore another thing must be true. Another similar thing must be true. The example given in your textbook is if you're good at tennis, you'll probably be good at ping pong because they're similar. But are they really similar enough? That's the problem with reasoning by analogy. So these are all valid forms of reasoning, but they could all also have problems in the specific cases that you use them. In addition to these breaking down, sometimes when these things break down, we call them reasoning fallacies. And then there's a bunch of other things that we add on here that are called reasoning fallacies. Fallacies as in fault, as in it's false reasoning. So in your textbook, some of these are in your textbook, and then there's a couple that are not. And they may apply to an exercise you have to do. So the error with inductive reasoning or specific instance, reasoning from specific instance, where you say, you take those small things, like my phys ed course, the other phys ed course, therefore all phys ed courses, right? What if it's a hasty generalization? In other words, what if you've jumped to this conclusion and you don't actually have enough evidence? Those specific instances are not enough evidence to reach that generalization. So that's jumping to a conclusion or hasty generalization. You needed more information. Those were not good enough examples that you used, those small cases. You can read examples of hasty generalization in your textbook. Then there's a false cause, which would be, and actually I have these out of order a little bit. Let's look next at non sequitur. That's not in your textbook, non sequitur, because that applies directly to the deductive reasoning, which is a false principle. What if one of those things that you chose to be a general principle is not true, right? What if you either, sometimes people will use these fallacies intentionally to mislead us, or what if by accident you've chosen a false principle that is not true? Then you have a non sequitur, something which is out of line, which doesn't belong, all right? And therefore the rest of the deductive reasoning is no good. To go back to false cause, this would be an error in causal reasoning. So the same way that hasty generalization is an error in specific instance or inductive reasoning, and non sequitur or false principle is an error in deductive reasoning, false cause or post hoc, ergo propter hoc for the Latin, which you sometimes hear referred to. And non sequitur actually is in Latin also, but false cause is a problem in causal reasoning. So the example is that something comes before, but it doesn't necessarily, wasn't in causal. Like today it rained and I finished my homework. Therefore, when it rains, I finish my homework. No, those things did happen, and one happened before the other, but just because something that happens before, therefore doesn't cause something that comes later. In other words, the fact that that little Latin phrase means after this, therefore because of this. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. But we know that things that happen after aren't necessarily caused exactly by the things that happened before. They can just be coincidences. Invalid analogy, of course, is a problem with reasoning from analogy. What if the example given in your text is employees are like nails. Just as nails, they must be hit on the head to get them to work. So must employees. Those two things are not the same. Employees are not like nails. They're completely different things. People are not nails. Therefore, the analogy breaks down. So, if the two things we're comparing should not be compared, then we have an invalid analogy. Then we move on to a number which are not directly connected to your these four choices here, those four types of reasoning, but are still valid. One of them is bandwagon, and I don't believe, bandwagon is on your list. Yeah, it's like everybody agrees with it. Everybody agrees, so therefore it must be right, right? Everybody's doing it. We've got to do it too. Everybody agrees, therefore it must be right. And of course, that isn't true. Just because everybody else agrees to it doesn't mean that it's right. Red herring is the idea that produce an irrelevant issue to divert attention. So you say, the example in your textbooks, how dare my opponent accuse me of political corruption when he doesn't even know how to tie his shoes. That's not the example given. But and then he points to the shoes and says they're untied. How can he accuse me of corruption if he can't even tie his own shoes? It's a red herring. The fact you can or can't tie your shoes doesn't have anything to do with whether you can accuse someone of political corruption. Right? You can point out something, maybe even something that's true, but it isn't. It's irrelevant. It's a red herring. It's just to distract attention. Ad hominem is listed in your textbook also, and it means against the man. And it's when instead of having instead of arguing with somebody based on facts and reason and evidence, you turn it into a personal attack. In the example given in your text, someone begins an argument based on fact, but then says, but let's not forget that she comes from a very wealthy family. It's got nothing to do with it, you know? And she doesn't know how to dress properly, or she's, did something else wrong or something. So we have an attack, a personal attack, which is again meant to distract us from the real evidence involved. Either or, sometimes called a false dilemma, to give someone two choices, as if that's the only two choices they have, and say, you've got to pick one of these. It's this or that. The government must either raise taxes or eliminate services. Aren't there some other choices? Yes, there are. So we could actually cut waste, or we could do lots of other things to come up with the money, or we could find less expensive services. Or so either or is another way to these fallacies. Some of these, this would not be created as just an accidental error in reasoning. These may have been created intentionally to mislead. Like a slippery slope argument. It says that because some things have happened, other things must happen. We're heading down a slippery slope. Once the boulder gets started, it can't be stopped. They assume that taking the first step will inevitably lead to the later. You've done that one thing, and if you do that, you know what's going to happen. You're going to keep on going and do more. Slippery slope argument. Appeal to tradition and appeal to novelty are very similar. Appeal to tradition means we've always done it that way, therefore it's right to do it that way. Obviously, that's not always true. Appeal to novelty means it's new and different, it must be better. Obviously, that's not always true. So again, these are often used intentionally to mislead. And straw man is another one which is not in your textbook. But the idea of a straw man is it's as if we have built a false enemy that we're attacking. So if I'm arguing against you, what I would do is, on whatever policy we're arguing about, instead of attacking your policy, I would attack my version of your policy. I would make up something and say that's what he stands for, and I tell you why that's wrong, but that isn't what you stand for. That isn't your argument. That isn't your policy. I have misled people to think that I am attacking your policy when really I'm attacking something that isn't your policy, or is just a poor version of it, or a poor explanation of it. So I've created a straw man. I've created something easy to defeat when actually defeating you and your argument and your evidence would be harder. So it's a straw man argument. Okay, so reading your text and having had this explanation, you should be able to do an exercise in this. And what I've given you is a Word document that looks like this. Persuasive speech reasoning exercise. And what I want you to do is, for the first four, go ahead and label. You can either write in this document or you can make your own document. Tell me what kind of reasoning is being used, first of all, from our types of reasoning, and then tell me, is there an error in that reasoning? And let me tell you, most, if not all of these, there's going to be a problem. Okay, so you can label the type of reasoning that's being used, and then tell me if there is, and there probably is, a problem. What is the problem with that reasoning? Right, from our list of fallacies. Although the reasoning will be from the list of reasoning. And then I had some straight up fallacies. You don't have to name the kind of reasoning that's being used here. It might be hard to work out anyway, but you can just list what is the fallacy, what reasoning fallacy is being committed here in these examples, 1 through 7. And then just save that and stick it in the Dropbox.